Okay, so I'd like to welcome you to the Empowering Young Societal Innovators for Equity and Renewal Special Interest Group. So that's the EYSIER SIG. And what we want to be talking about today is... Okay, so I'd like to welcome you to the Empowering Young Societal Innovators for Equity and Renewal. How dialogue works, sorry, we had a bit of an echo there, in terms of supporting children to have an opportunity to talk back rather than being talked at, and rather than being kept in a situation where they don't really have an opportunity to discover their own understandings of their surroundings and the kinds of relationships they have with people who are in authority. So this session today is really going to focus on the notion of blame. So we want to talk about building children's confidence and well-being to not blame themselves when things go wrong, and to describe and understand the real causes of blame in communities of all faiths and none in a secular society, but particularly in the classroom and the relationship between schools and families and communities. I've noticed that there are more and more participatory family engagement apps on telephones, and these are very much about pinging to a parent to say your child's doing well. And I'm concerned that this is not necessarily constructing relationships with the school and with the family to support the child's progress and their understanding of learning. It's kind of more a stimulus response to you're behaving well, or it could become you're not behaving well. And I'm really concerned about how we are using dialogue to recognise the qualities of human uniqueness. And human uniqueness is recognising the qualities that give us moral status. Now, what we have done is spent hundreds of hours and millions of different currencies in court and policy meetings to draw a boundary, a red line of what is humane and what is not. So attributing blame to a wrongdoer appears to be clear in terms of they're guilty or they're not guilty. But what I want to do in this talk is examine this assumption and suggest that blaming someone or blaming ourselves can be affected by everyday social perceptions and motives. So subtle differences in perceptions of humanity may have powerful implications for our perceived moral status. Moral standards, in theory, are universally applied on the basis of basic human mental capacities, for example, the Declaration of Human Rights. However, current research shows that subtle differences in the attribution of human characteristics predict variations in people's moral judgment of others. People may be considered less morally valuable or less able to act according to moral principles depending on their individual traits or group memberships or gender. Indeed, stereotypes have been shown to have important implications in decision-making in all sorts of contexts, but particularly jury decision-making and the law. So the current work implies that stereotype content associated with humanness may play an important role in students optimizing their learning in the classroom and the teacher really recognizing them for who they are. However, if we do not understand that people may be considered less morally valuable or less able to act according to moral principles, depending on their moral traits or groups, then we may be making a lot of assumptions, particularly on race. And we may not even understand that there is a clash of cultures, particularly if we are a member of the dominant culture. 25 case studies in China, England, France, Iraq, Israel from an Arab perspective, Italy, Lebanon, Nigeria, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Russia, United States in the higher education perspective, Egypt, Finland, Greece, Israel from a Jewish perspective, Japan, Kazakhstan, South Korea, Germany, Hungary, Guyana, India, Pakistan, and the United States from a K through 12 perspective, which was a policy analysis project that I was principal investigator of, maps shifts in education policy over a 70-year period from the end of World War II, and identifies economic policy has underpinned shifts from a welfarist ideology to a neoliberal ideology. The case studies reveal that economic policy shifts from the welfarist to the neoliberalist were driven by colonial Western powers' end to the exploitation of the Middle East's income from oil. This was because the Middle East nationalized the income from their oil managed through OPEC. Colonial Western powers turned to the colonization of the stock exchanges, starting in the US in the 1970s, which I map in my book, Education Policy, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. All papers identify that a behaviorist approach, which is a stimulus and response that Pavlov discovered with dogs. He would ring a bell and a dog would salivate if it was going to have food. And in the end, if the food wasn't there and they rang the bell, the dog would still salivate. So this behaviorist approach in classrooms progresses the colonization of the thinking of the learners, which underpins compliance to orders and makes colonization of systems easier because no one questions it due to their condition of compliance. In fact, they even start to blame themselves for the problems. So colonization of thinking through behaviorist approaches prevents critical autonomous thinking, and Woodson at the turn of the 20th century states, if you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his action. When you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself about what he will do. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. If you make a man think he is justly an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told, and if there is no back door, his very nature will demand one. So colonizing the thinking of learners and thereby colonizing their behaviors prepares them to blame themselves when things go wrong, rather than describe and understand the processes and practices that are creating the social contract and the structures in the form of the social policy which can determine closed systems or open opportunity for children to take their place in the economy and have access to middle-class benefits and economic well-being. So colonization of thinking prepares people at worst for the colonization of their unit labor costs by shareholders of public corporations. At best, behaviorist approaches that colonize thinking in classrooms prevents critical autonomous thinking and interrupts the development of behavior empowerment. So behavior empowerment is underpinned by personally tried and tested methods that provide good solutions in new and challenging situations that the children have had chance to find proof of concept for when they've tested different hypotheses in the safety of their classroom with their friends and with their teacher. So they have had the chance to learn how to make good decisions based on evidence rather than blaming themselves based on confusion. So to do this, young people learn how to ask meaningful and worthwhile questions, explore the logic of what they are reading using alternative perspectives, and are able to develop methods that deliver hypotheses to be tested. Such approaches transcend behaviorist approaches that do not allow talkback. And behaviorist approaches can create internal angst. When a young person is being told or conditioned to believe something that conflicts with their personal beliefs or their own cultural heritage or their own faith or none. In such cases, young people need time to think through the new knowledge being introduced to them and to compare and contrast it, which is critical thinking, with what they currently believe. They can then synthesize the different ways of knowing that inform intentions and behaviors. If bite-sized chunks of knowledge are just memorized and the important process of synthesizing the old knowledge with the new knowledge is removed from the curriculum or moved from the thinking time in the classroom, young people can experience this angst and can fear being in the classroom. Being told to hold different kinds of knowledge within one identity that clashes or are contradictory, with no opportunity to work through the differences and synthesize them into the whole identity, can splinter personalities, which can diminish mental health capital. So behaviorist approaches, as I referred to earlier, may be useful to train dogs, but they are not useful for underpinning healthy development of immature citizens to mature citizens, and they do not create the opportunity for healthy aging of all citizens. So behaviorist approaches may underpin the transition of young people into society to become passive recipients of an exploitative economy driven by a hierarchical top-down industrial strategy. Such an approach does not align with the Sustainable Development Goals, where all citizens contribute to sustainable economic growth, as talked by the United Nations, and delivered through targets. And they can use their creativity as the body of the whole in the social contract, and at a personal level as an individual whole healthy person. So in solidarity, citizens can work together and identify and question attempts to exploit and colonize their human capital. Thus, citizens can work together to propel entrepreneurial economies empowered by a strategy for economic growth to deliver the SDGs that may include a meaningful and worthwhile industrial strategy. So if enterprises have enough surplus, they can sustain if a competitor introduces a new product or service. Thus, competition is healthy in human evolution, but it does not undermine solidarity in sustainable peace. The SDGs have targets that require empowered citizens to work for equity and eradicate poverty. And this can socialize risks, socialize investments, and socialize rewards. At the same time, to achieve the SDG targets, it is helpful to consider Adam Smith's approach, because developing entrepreneurs requires developing critical, autonomous citizens who can work in solidarity to optimize sustainable profits. These profits can be shared, held as reserves for investment in research and development, reward the courageous entrepreneurs, or replenish the reserves required for sustainable growth through unpredicted reduction in income. But the classrooms will need good pedagogical relationships that promote assessment for personal and social learning, so that we don't keep giving students tasks and ask them to complete them and then choose one or two things that are right and ignore the rest that are wrong because we don't want to overwhelm them. What I think we need to do is go back and ensure that what they are doing is right and support them in getting things right. And if they are doing too many things that aren't correct, we can bring them back to a stage where they're doing most things correct, and we can support and guide them. Because if they do the wrong thing 22 times, then it will become a habit, and it's really difficult to break that. So it's worth starting where the student is at, rather than teaching a curriculum at a student. And I think that if students are given that chance to really learn and use their assessment for learning as formative feedback, which informs the planning for the teacher that may be differentiated because children are at different levels, the children will not blame themselves when they go off target in terms of meeting what they need to do to pass the exams. And taking them back a little bit with assessment for learning could give them the foundations they need to then really excel and do incredibly well and meet all their targets. But it does mean having the courage to not blame the children and to look at a system that is teaching at a child rather than working with the child to understand what intended learning outcomes they need and the best pathway for them to achieve that. So to ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including among others through education for sustainable development, sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, the promotion of a culture of peace and non-violence, global citizenship and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development, culturally, economically, in the labour market linked to the OECD PISA report, and politically with grassroots participation in meeting targets, which is the Sustainable Development Goal 4, target 4.7, we really need to rethink our relationships in the classroom with the child, and we need to start looking at praising and supporting good behaviour rather than focusing on, I think, the blaming for bad behaviour when we've actually taken away the intrinsic motivation and pathways to success and middle class benefits. So the talk really is about understanding if we are in systems that are blaming a child for something that is going wrong, how can we be on our guard to ensure we are not denying the humanity of others or the humanity of ourselves or our children based on stereotypes that may define some as less human than others? So human nature refers to characteristics that distinguish humans from animals, such as openness, emotionality, vitality, and warmth. But if human uniqueness is denied to people, as Woodson identified, who are trained to go to the back door, then the position of a person, if you can imagine a dichotomy of human uniqueness on one end and no human uniqueness on the other, and a dichotomy of human nature as across human nature at the top and no human nature at the bottom, then where someone sits on that can inform judgments of moral status, resulting in people being blamed or blaming themselves for being in a system they did not create because they are part of it. So they're in the system, but they're not of the system. And I think this is something we really need to think about in our dialogues with children. So participating in building the rules of the state, the social contract, and I noticed the Financial Times discussed this recently about the social contract. It needs to recognise how we as humans fully and freely describe and understand blame and how to distinguish that from responsibility. So in sum, this talk draws on attribution psychology to help explain our behaviour and to describe and understand our personal mental models or constructs that apply the knowledge to our everyday lives. So this knowledge empowers us to be the leaders of our own transformation that transforms fear and blame in our lives to feeling good about ourselves and loving ourselves and being kind to ourselves. So it's still being realistic and understanding, you know, where mistakes are. It's not a case of we are not going to take responsibility, but it's a case of really understanding that unconditional positive self-regard can help us develop moral status, and we can do that in relationship with others, in the classroom rules, and our own moral compass that can help children do the same through dialogue with their parents, with you. So this is important if dominant groups in communities wish to exploit other groups, and can do so by using education to reduce the human uniqueness and the human nature of the masses. And Habib Kazi and I talk about this in terms of how textbooks in Indian textbooks can actually develop an identity that is a very behaviorist one rather than a critical constructivist one. So what I'm trying to think about is a vital step in the journey to empowering young societal innovators for equity and renewal to promote good self-esteem, high levels of human uniqueness and human nature through dialogue in communities of all faiths and none, and in a secular society using a blueprint for character development for evolution, which we'll be presenting later on in this series with Professor Haurimam and Professor Mark Boigner. So attribution theory deals with how the social perceiver uses information to arrive at the causal explanation for events. So are we giving children the chance to explore the empirical, logical and ethical causes for events? Or is there this sense of they've been trained and conditioned to believe they're not good enough, they are unsatisfactory, and they must go to the back door? In essence, attribution is the process of inferring the cause of behavior and events, and helps to explain our behavior with our intentions and our values and how we perceive the way others act. So in 3-stage processes, behavior is observed, behavior is determined to be deliberate or not, behavior is attributed to internal or external causes, and achievement can be attributed to effort, ability, level of task, difficulty, or even luck, depending on how we are developing our relationships and the human uniqueness and the human nature, the extent to which it's honored and respected. So that's the end of my 20-minute talk. What I really wanted to do is get some questions from the participants and from the panel, and really to think about how and in what ways might we self-blame? And to what extent do you think we are conditioned from an early age to take on responsibility and ownership for things that weren't ours to carry? And what is the role of control and self-blame? And how about human uniqueness and human nature? And what is the role of dialogue to help us understand and transform blame to recognition of each other's uniqueness and nature? So I'll hand over to you now to have the panel and the discussion. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Alison. That's really interesting. I have few comments when it comes to the behaviorist theory and how does it relate to my context. When you mentioned deterministic approach and the reductionist approach in the behaviorist theory, there is in my context, there's the hidden values, and they are, I don't know if that makes sense. There's the hidden and there's the one that is exposed. The hidden one is, I would say, it's the deterministic one, which is the stimulus response association. Is that you do this, you get that, you don't do this, you don't get that, or you get punished. So it's a reward punishment system. And the other one that is exposed is the reductionist. And that's what I want to talk about. The reductionist one is when this theory and its application, it overlooks subjective experiences and reduces all aspects of human behavior, such as emotions, character, or whatever goes inside, down to just, it reduces it to a level of explanation. So in society, how is that translated? Is if you're feeling worried, anxious, tired, hungry, all of these, it is underestimated. It is reduced. It's like if I say, in our context, if I say, well, I'm tired, okay, it's because you're not strong. The response will be, it's because you're not strong, you see? So that's the reducing of emotions and feelings. There's no acknowledgement to any, what do they, I don't want to call them negative feelings, but just like unfavorable maybe, like feeling tired or feeling anxious or feeling stressed. These feelings are not acknowledged in my context. They are just dismissed. or you get blamed. Okay, so if you're stressed, it's because you don't know how to cope with situations. If you're scared, it's because you're a coward. If you're hungry, because you did not eat enough. Because in so many people I have met, and including myself in my experiences, I always used food as emotional substitution of problems that I was going through. So I used food, for example, to fill this gap, because my emotions, I do not know how to acknowledge my emotions. I do not know how to express them. And the society anyway does not allow you to do so. And I'm not sure, because I don't want to blame society, because it becomes a vicious circle. If you blame your parents, then you blame society, and then they blame you, and it becomes really vicious. But I would say that there are so many circumstances and factors that haven't enabled an environment that accommodates and does not reduce people's feelings and acknowledges them. And I would say one of these factors, for example, can be war. These are factors can be corruption in the government. There are so many factors around this that our parents are conditioned to behave so they condition us as well to behave so. So I think it all starts with people who wants to lead change, really. How do we move away from these from this theory that I think it got us into very dark places, I would say. I mean, extrapolating as animal studies to human behavior is quite sad and upsetting. And even animals now, even with pet behavior and training dogs, you know, the punishment system is not used anymore. It's all about rewards. So even that has changed, and we see the curriculum is not changing, society is not changing. Everything is still based on the behaviorist theory, because they believe it's, as we said, it's deterministic. It can be measurable. So they want, from that theory, they want to measure behavior. This is good, this is bad, this is rated, this is, and especially when we look, for example, at mathematics. When you see students going and sitting for the SAT examinations, they just take a multiple choice question, right? So you really don't know how did they get to that answer. You don't investigate their thinking. You don't understand how they go about a problem. So this is measurable. If you tick a box, they can measure it, and it's easy to correct, and it's easy, you know, to classify people. This is good and this is not good, and this passes. So it's easier, and it is more like mainstream. It makes the job for these, I call them business people, you know, it makes it easier for them, you know, to evaluate people. It makes easy to classify people, just like we classify animals. So reducing, measuring, deterministic approaches, all of these are the essence of education. They were the essence, that's how it started, you know, in so many, I wouldn't say how it started, but this is how it was. I think based on I can remember my research, I think it's 1950s, start 1950s. It's when Skinner, Pavlov, and they started with these assumptions, and that's how it moves through the industrial phase. I hope I'm right about this as far as I remember reading about it. So, and I wanted to understand why is this theory is still winning over some constructivist learning theories. And it's because, and I think the major thing that I found is it's measurable, because they want to measure. You can measure a student response, and that's what's important. Although schools, I know from my daughter's school, and I don't know if it's like this in other schools, they're really looking at how students reply and about how they're learning, and and they evaluate. I found on the report card more narratives rather than scores, just scores. The score was not important, the narrative was, commenting on her achievement or progress or what she's doing. And that takes time for teachers to do, and teachers to write, and teachers to be able to monitor students' progress. And we see the class sizes in different schools like 40, 35, 30. I mean, teachers cannot cope and cannot really monitor closely students' learning process if the class sizes are so big. So I think all these factors contribute to still, for some curriculum countries and education systems that are still adopting the behaviorism in general. That's it for me now.
Thank you, Mayssa, and thank you, Alison, for your interesting contribution. I would like to comment on an aspect that you have highlighted regarding formative evaluation. In my experience as a teacher in Italy at school, has shown me that formative assessment boosts students' motivation and educates children's feelings. After the homework, the most important part is the reflection on the error by each student. In this phase, the children experience that they cannot stop and look at the more or less beautiful grade they have achieved. It is not enough to know and apply the rules mechanically. The reflection on the error helps the children to ask themselves questions about what they have done and gain awareness of their strengths and weaknesses. This has strengthened the pupil's self-esteem because they do not feel damaged by negative marks. The final grade takes into account the effort made by the students in the face of the reflection on the error. I wonder if this reflection is also possible in the family. Thank you.
Daniela, could you say a little bit more about the reflection in the family and how dialogue might help that, please?
Yes, because I think it is very interesting if when a child do something wrong, in the family it is possible to have a moment when parents talk about this error with her child. This is the phase of the reflection on the error.
So thinking about what Mayssa said, and that some families are carrying behaviorist approaches and maybe even trauma. We have, you know, my parents, for example, lived through the Second World War. My father went cross-eyed from the Coventry Blitz. So I'm just thinking, if people are carrying such trauma, are we giving them the chance to find out about whether they blame themselves for things going wrong, and how are they working that out in their relationship with their children, and how can we support them not blaming themselves and their children for a systemic problem?
Could I perhaps say something here? I mean, it's funny when you were talking and when Mayssa was speaking as well, the issue about intergenerationality was coming through in my thoughts as well. And I think I've also reflected on the fact that in the previous session where we went into much longer discussion, that like you, Alison, my parents lived through the Second World War. My father did national service for the UK and experienced quite a lot, I think, in that time, to the point where he would have quite happily done more if he'd had the opportunity. But I also know that because of the circumstances of his life, he didn't have the opportunity to do much more than the very basic in terms of secondary, what was regarded as secondary education at that time. But when he went out into the world of work, he recognised that formal qualifications were important for that purpose, and put himself through evening classes in order to gain some of the exam results that you would anticipate would automatically happen when a child goes to secondary school. And from that perspective, he attempted with me, and certainly with my brother and sister in following, to begin to give us a level of support which probably would be akin to what's happening in preschool education now, certainly in the UK. I'm not sure about anywhere else. Reading from an early age was something that both my parents, and particularly my father, did with me and my brother and sister, teaching me basic numeracy and encouraging me to be able to start the reading process and be able to write my own name was important. And a lot of that is reflected now in what's happening in Scotland in terms of preschool education. The idea that certainly from a political perspective, they're very keen to see children who coming into the first year of their primary education being able to have some basic skills before they get any further in that first year. But the thought behind all of that was that in doing that, he was attempting to perhaps move away from what he himself had experienced as a child. Now, I never knew my grandparents, so I don't know what they went through, but I have heard enough anecdotal information to make me think that their own lives were challenging in themselves, and so their ability to be able to support their family might have been affected by that. And I think societally, it's too late in the evening now for me to get my words completely correct, but I think there's certainly still a degree of not pressure, I suppose, but in different generations to without realising it, pass on some of the nuances of what they've experienced themselves onto the next generation. And as a result, that carries on and carries on. And I think what you said, I think, was correct, that unless you have someone who's prepared to move away from that and take a different direction and actively take their children in a different direction by supporting them in saying you have the right to be listened to, you have the right to be to speak and to format your own thoughts. And if you don't get it right, that's not in itself a problem, that's not in itself a wrong. We only learn in some respects by sometimes making mistakes, and that in doing that, you shouldn't be blamed for anything. You should have you should have the opportunity to say, okay, well, if I didn't do that right then, I can then move on and find a way to do it right. So it's about breaking that cycle. In different contexts, I've talked about moving from a vicious cycle into a virtuous one, and that's probably the crux of what we need to actually be moving towards now.
To what extent, Kathleen, do you think that that's really more important, I suppose, in the recovery from COVID-19?
Oh, I think it's probably particularly crucial in that. I mean, one of the reasons that I got involved in this group at all was because I'm looking for, I suppose, clues to my own engagement with my own granddaughter, to support her as she comes through the first few years of her development. And it was interesting that earlier today I was listening to a piece on my phone about how we support children at that early age, what we do with them in terms of the very basic skills that you're trying to impart in them, because they're not getting the same stimuli that they would normally get in terms of engagement with other children, other people. and it was something as simple as singing to them, you know, singing songs, singing, you know, nursery rhymes. And it was, I found myself singing to my granddaughter this afternoon, which is a feat that I wouldn't necessarily impact on anybody else, but it was something that was, it was just something, a tune that came into my head, and I started singing to her, and she sort of stood and looked at me for a moment and went, okay, and went back to do what she was doing, which is for a 15-month-old, you can't really expect very much more. But, you know, it was about the dialogue and, you know, continuing to speak to a child and letting them hear words, letting them hear stories, using basic books to augment their own basic language, such as they have at that, you know, at any given age, and you know, see a story behind the very basic story, to tell them that story, and then help them, you know, expand the vocabulary and expand the connections that they make between the words and the things that they're seeing or the things that they're hearing. And you know, she's in her own little world at the moment, and I know that, you know, language will come, and it does. I mean, she understands more than she can actually impart herself. It's interesting when already that, you know, when I speak to her and I say certain things, that she acknowledges what I'm saying, and she knows who I'm speaking about, in her own little world of the people that she is familiar with. And that's what I was saying earlier when we were talking at the beginning, that she has a particular fascination with buckles and straps and things like that on the security on her high chair, for example, or the security in her car seat. And she wasn't particularly willing to be lifted out of her high chair this evening until I told her that her papa was coming home, and it was in the driveway, and immediately the hands went up, and she, you know, she recognised the name, and that was her. She was quite happy. But to go back to what we've been talking about, it's not about breaking the generational connectivity. It's about finding a different way to channel that in order to move towards, you know, reassurance and validation of a child's individuality and about how they approach things. It's happening in some respects, but I think we've still got a long way to go. And I think in terms of COVID, it's been made more difficult because we're asking a lot of parents who've had to deal with homeschooling. Certainly from what I've been hearing from neighbours who've been dealing with their own children, they've found it quite challenging. And I think everything that I've seen in terms of news coverage in Scotland certainly suggests that it's not something that parents are necessarily skilled for, and nor should we expect them to be. But the ability of an individual parent to say to a child, you've got to sit down and do this piece of work, out with the context of school, where they've got that discipline of a teacher who's saying this is part of what you're supposed to be doing. It's not an easy thing to do, and I suppose we expect an awful lot of parents who don't necessarily have those skills, and I don't know, should we be asking that of them? Yes, if they're a good parent, they want the best for their child and they want to find a way to support them, but I think that issue of how we've dealt with children during COVID is, yes, it must have been challenging for so many people, and I think it's without a shadow of a doubt there's going to be a lot to do to recover that ground with this particular generation of children who are, you know, have been part of this whole lockdown process. And that's just before you even get to all of the other things that impinge. And, you know, I'm sure, you know, others here will know that better than I do, the societal pressures that are on children, you know, in other countries, you know, where they're subject to unrest and, you know, greater poverty than exists in the UK at present. That, you know, it can't begin to imagine the pressure that must be on both those children and those families.
Thank you, Kathleen, for sharing your experience. I think in this time of pandemic, we have perhaps re-evaluated the presence of the grandparents. Can you say something more about the role of the grandparents in forging children's self-esteem, please?
I think, well, it might be difficult for me because I'm only a relatively new grandparent. As I say, my granddaughter's only 15 months old, so her world is a very simple one, and she has a fairly small network of adults, you know, in her world to, you know, I suppose communicate with and, you know, and gain experience from. Obviously, as things change, that will change as well. But we're very fortunate that my daughter is very keen to ensure that she gets as much experience as possible. You know, wants to give her all the stimuli that she believes is valuable to her in order to give her the best start in life, especially within the current circumstances. And what I want to do is to try and support that as her grandmother, and, you know, make sure that she gets every opportunity to experience as much as she should be able to at this point in her development. I don't have a great deal of recollection about any of my grandparents because of I suppose the time where there was only, I think, one grandparent who I actually remember, who died when I was 6, and it's funny, the one thing that stands out with me is her food. And it's funny when Mayssa was saying about food being some link to her, and it was something about a particular meal that I can remember having when I was a small child, and that has always stuck as almost the first taste that I can remember. And yet there are other aspects of my relationship with her at the time that don't mean anything to me at all, but that thing sticks in my mind. And it's strange that should be the case. Now, I know that the opportunity not to have that experience with grandparents is something something I've missed out on. And I suppose from that perspective, my view of how I engage with my granddaughter is really important to me, because I do think that I want to have influence is maybe not the right word, because I think that influence is primary to her mother and father, but I want to be able to support that, her opportunity to get as much development as she possibly can prior to her starting school, and then once she starts school, being able to support that further with whatever she needs. In the last session, I remember one of the contributors said that he thought that there was less pressure on young people these days. And my view is that the pressure is not less, I think it's different. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. There's a whole range of reasons why the pressure hasn't changed in the way in which our children grow up. I think there are different pressures, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And I suppose from this grandmother's perspective, it's to make sure that those pressures are reduced as best possible. And if there's anything I can do to help that, then I want to be able to do that.
Thank you very much.
I'm just reflecting on the things that we've all said during this panel, and thinking about the kinds of behaviors that children might have, and the fact that we might be blaming ourselves and blaming them when things are systemic. To what extent do you think parents can seek support to understand the kinds of issues that they might be confused about? Where can they begin to find answers, do you think? A kind of some sort of knowledge base with and for the families, for society. How can they begin to tap into the kind of knowledge that might help them understand this role of blame in our society?
I think that's a tricky one. I mean, I think it would depend, it's really dependent on which part of the world we come from in terms of the support networks that are there. I mean, there are different organisations that will support different individuals, and I guess it depends on just how serious the issue is, how far you can take that. I mean, there's I hesitate to throw in some of the more extreme routes that you could go down in terms of getting that degree of support, but you know, there are different ways in which you can manage that. I think this is a conversation I've had with you already, Alison, that the way in which we teach our teachers as well doesn't necessarily always help us reduce that risk of blame, because we're so anxious these days to get people through the door to actually become teachers that some of the systems in place don't necessarily take us to that journey where, you know, the issue of being positive about how a child operates within the classroom is necessarily always maintained. And, you know, it comes down to the individual's reaction to those people. Getting someone in my son's school to recognise that just because he smiled didn't mean he was being critical of the teacher was something I ended up having to raise in a meeting with that teacher and say, look, you know, he just smiles, that's what he does. But, you know, that's a very simplistic way of, you know, addressing that. But there's probably not the same network of organisations, both formal and informal, to give that degree of support to parents when they're feeling that vulnerable about the issue of blame. And I don't know that it's something that's really been properly addressed to that extent. But again, it's about the individual experience of that, about blame and blame culture, and how then it becomes reflected upon their own children. And we've got to, as I say, you know, break that kind of, you know, very difficult cycle and find a way back to, you know, getting to a point where we do value what a child says and does, and find a way to positively demonstrate that rather than simply blame them for something and not give them the skills to right that wrong.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful answer. And it's interesting you talk about initial teacher training, because Mayssa Altay and I wrote a paper from her research in Iraq that looked at developing an empirical teacher leadership model. And the literature suggests there just isn't very much out there. And it's interesting that we aren't actually looking at research that develops an empirical teacher leadership model and develops a job description that maps that in terms of how we can optimize learning. And I think sometimes when an Ofsted inspector comes in to a classroom and says, you know, this is an unsatisfactory lesson after observing it, thinking about attribution, I know that perhaps the ideal world is that Ofsted inspector would then teach an outstanding lesson with the same children and the same intended learning outcomes. But I don't think it's that simple, because they don't, they blame and then they walk away. And I'm just wondering if we've actually got a whole systemic blame approach instead of, you know, if we've got the best teachers in place, which I believe we have, because we can trust our selection process. And at the end of the day, humans are, this is who we are. This is our teaching profession. It is the best. If we're going to come in and say this lesson is unsatisfactory and then not demonstrate an outstanding one immediately, then I think there's something more to it that goes beyond the teacher and beyond the children. And I'm just looking at some systemic issues that we're perhaps not addressing in terms of issues of blame. And that I think, going back to what you said, Mayssa, I think in the 50s we began to develop the Baldwin report that was at the same time as the welfarist approach, and a golden age for white people in the economy in the US, but obviously with the civil rights and the Black Lives Matter agenda and Dr. Martin Luther King, there certainly wasn't a golden era for people of colour, but that ran alongside the Baldwin report and the child-centred approach. It was a time in which we were looking to be more human-centred, more humanistic. And then the behaviourist approaches came in with the Baldwin's report going out with the black papers, and that pathologized child-centeredness, and it pathologized the progressive approach. So I'm just wondering, you know, maybe we need to explore ways in which what worked in those times, and perhaps look at how we can develop critical thinking in ITE that would allow an Ofsted inspector to confidently go into a school and say, I can fail this class and now I can show you how it becomes outstanding immediately. I think that's the kind of, if those conditions aren't there, we're still part of the blame system, maybe.
At the risk of, I had basically had not wanted to get into this too far because one, I'm not a teacher, and two, I don't have any experience of the English education system. I suppose the difficulty you've got is that when you get an Ofsted inspector coming in, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, and I probably am here, Alison, to some extent, you have to accept that there's a degree of subjectivity going on when they think about what they're experiencing when they hear, you know, when they determine what's a good or a bad lesson, and that's not to excuse the Ofsted in that respect. I think probably any inspection process, regardless of what country it's happening in, there has to be a degree of subjectivity in that respect. You would anticipate it would be the case. But again, I go back to that whole point about how we take people through initial teacher education and help them understand that we need to break that cycle, and how we get them to understand that you know, this has, if you start to then reflect on your own experience when you're teaching, that isn't necessarily the best way in order to pass on the knowledge that you're actually, you know, trying to give the young people. I'm probably digging a bit of a hole for myself here, so I'll probably stop at this point. I've got some thoughts on this, but it's probably better if I could spend some time thinking about them, and then I can maybe feed them back into future meetings.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, because I think that we obviously need really rigorous accountability. But I know that with the Students' Council that used to be in place, I think we used to be accountable, and HMI would come in and support and guide the people that they were developing. And I think that connection is broken between the people who are making the judgments and then the people who are then supporting and putting things right. And so maybe, because obviously Ofsted do an important job in terms of, you know, of regulating and ensuring that we meet criteria and we meet the standards. But my concern is if it's not clear how we do that, and there are so many different models. I was teaching online on a Romanian university recently, and I found 12 different models of teacher training in England. So that we don't really seem to have any kind of consensus on how, and which then leaves teachers, I think, how do we make sure that they are as secure as they want to be and need to be in a profession, to develop the relationships with the parents so that we can remove the blame culture and the teachers feel confident that they are respected as a profession that deserves that, because, you know, they work I'm a teacher in school as well, we work very, very hard for the children and we want the best for them and for their families. So I think the dialogue, what chance do we have for dialogue if we've now got these mobile phone apps when we're pinging, you know, you've done well today, parents. So I just wondered if it's part of a systemic blame, you know, if it's institutionalized somehow.
Alison, could you explain better what are, in your opinion, the most important aspects of teacher training according to your experience from the humanistic perspective, please?
I think the most important are the recruitment aspects. I go back to John Dewey, and I also look at Professor Richard Pring's chapter 7 in Philosophy of Educational Research, which looks at the virtues of the teacher. You know, I'm looking at the virtues of someone being honest, you know, people who don't lie, who are role models as leaders of classroom learning. And I think that once you've got the right person in place, it's not necessarily the person with the highest grades. You know, sometimes people might be attracted by high levels of money through Teach First, but maybe they come in for a short amount of time, maybe even the minimum period, and then move on to a job that has higher income outside education. And maybe people who are vocational, who really want the children and the students to be the best they can be, and through to FE and HE, maybe they have maybe lower grades in attainment, but they have a better way of helping students understand that. So I think the key thing for me is ensuring that all student teachers meet the standards, but I think it's exploring what those standards are. And for example, in the chapter 3 of Education Policy as a Roadmap for Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, I take 2 of the standards and I unpack them about how we differentiate learning. So we start to look at systems in which we can say, well, this is what the children need to learn, and this is a process of how they can learn it, and this is how we can assess them and use formative feedback to develop that. So if I was going to go in to do an observation of a lesson that a teacher has taught, trainee teacher, I would probably be looking to, yes, we've got the standards that they need to meet, but I'm also looking at what the children are doing, very much like lesson planning that you know is in Japan, and certainly was developed by Professor David Pedder and colleagues at the University of Leicester. We watch the children. How are the children learning? Because it's the child that's the most important thing. We're not going in to assess the performance of the teacher. And what that teacher's doing is facilitating the learning of the child. And the issue is that that child may learn something on that day and it fully become realized as a learning point 5 years later. You know, when you look at a cyclical curriculum, they could really consolidate that learning, that if that teacher hadn't given them that foundation in that year 1 class, they wouldn't have got it in the year 6 class. So it's so difficult. I think what Mayssa was saying about measuring attainment, it's very difficult to measure attainment when you are developing young people holistically in terms of they are able to express their emotions, they're able to become a fully human person. What is it, as Professor Richard Pring said in our last keynote, what is it to be fully human and to be, you know, recognized as such, this human uniqueness, the human value, the valorization of knowledge that empowers us to empower our teachers, to empower our children. And I think that we are accidentally making the teachers a tool to deliver a curriculum from a government policy. And there was a deliverology from Whitehall coming straight through. And I just wonder to what extent teachers are given the chance to say, I don't know that teaching this right now to this class is exactly right. And I was really fortunate when I was teaching in 95. I had a head teacher that said, you can come off curriculum. And I had this again in 97 with another head teacher when I went to another school. You can come off curriculum and you can teach the students differentiated. So I had a year 1-2 mix class, and I could teach some of my year 1 children the year 2 curriculum and some of the year 2 curriculum, the year 1 curriculum. And at the end of, I was fortunate to teach them for 2 years, the children got the best SATs results in the county. So it's having the confidence to say, okay, the curriculum says I have to teach you this now, but you're just not ready for that. And so in ITE, it's about the teacher, helping the teacher understand where the children are at and understanding what the children have learnt, what they need to learn, and how you facilitate that learning, how you present that knowledge that they need, and then the transferable skills that are about teamwork, collaboration, understanding themselves in relation to the other, becoming critical thinkers, making good decisions. You know, in reception, that's, do I have the orange or do I have the apple for my fruit? And do we really give them a chance to think about that? Or are we saying, I want my coffee, it's my break time, you have the apple and off you go. You know, it's a case of giving children time and space, but that at the age of 16, this is another issue of, are we allowing them to say, well, do you understand what a straw man is? Have we given you the thinking tools to understand what the straw man is in this particular case study from maybe Greek times, from the classics, and from those principles that you've now gone through with using ABCDE, can you apply it to maybe other conditions or other cases of today? And so unless we understand what a straw man is, aren't we going to keep having it and never really understand and hold people accountable for distracting us from what really is a root cause? So I think it's a case of, yes, I've talked about apples and oranges, and now I've talked about the straw man. But what I'm saying is these are principles that can be applied to all age groups. And I've been fortunate to teach from nursery, early years through to, you know, PhD, people retired. And I think the case is you start where the person is at and you develop the learning. So for ITE, I think it's empowering the profession to be the profession it deserves to be. And you wouldn't ask a surgeon to be told by a government minister how to perform brain surgery. So I just think, yes, government need to ratify policy, but I think teachers obviously need to be externally accountable and have external accountability in place, but they need to be trusted to lead professional learning and teaching because they're the best at that. And that's a long answer.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I do agree with you. Trust is the most important relation that we can accomplish between teachers, parents, and teachers, administration, teachers, government, because I believe that if you trust the teacher to do what is right for the children in the classroom, I think this is when learning starts happening, because the teacher is not scared of blame anymore, because there is trust. You trust her, you trust him, So the relationship of trust is, I think it's very important, because I raised it in so many staff meetings in my previously in the school, is we want to know how much homework you're giving. We want to know how much what's your lesson plan, what's and too many details, you know, that I feel I'm happy to tell you what's happening, but there's so many days you enter the class and it's not appropriate to apply your lesson plan because the children are not feeling well, for example, or you had a discussion about something that is different than the lesson plan. Because I think when you enter the classroom, you need to, I basically would, for myself, I would speak, I need to attend to their needs first to see how they're feeling, what's happening. I mean, if you start the day with the head teacher screaming in the building, you know, how can you just, you know, just try to start explaining mathematics, just like you're just really reducing their feelings here. So I would speak to them about something 10 minutes, 15 minutes, something positive, something to bring up, you know, their spirits high a bit and just try, you know, to make them happy. And then I would introduce the lesson. So I just, like, for example, when we went online as well, please record your sessions, we want to monitor them. It's like, don't you, if you trust the teachers inside the classroom, don't you trust them online with the students? So I just remembered this, Alison, when you mentioned trust, and also, and Kathleen, when you said like an inspector comes to the class and for us, it would be like the principal and the head of section and head of department would come into the class and they would evaluate teachers and they would write reports and things and the sarcasm is when they tell the teacher, well, you don't know how to teach. Fine, I don't know how to, can you tell me how, can you educate me? Can you tell me what's the best way, you know, to teach this and do that? But you don't find answers to that. You just find an evaluation where it says where the teacher went wrong, or highlighting very few positive aspects of her teaching practices. Because one of my friends, after I moved here, one of my friends, she was promoted in the school. She was promoted to be head of professional development, and she called me and she said, I'm trying to get teachers to the teacher appraisals. She's trying, so they're selecting teachers for evaluation and stuff. And she said, so many teachers are resisting and they're not interacting with me and they're not receiving this positively. I told her, you can't blame them, because these teachers are used to people who come and evaluate them just to find their mistakes, just to blame them for things that are happening or not happening. So you need to be patient with them, because it is a culture of blame. It is a culture of people who do not want to, even if I did a mistake. And I would say, yes, I did a mistake. Fine, just help me. How can I correct it? But in our culture, you cannot be wrong. You know, and you should, if you admit to a mistake, it's weakness. It is, and people will try to blame each other for things that are happening. So I just told her, you need to be patient with them, because this is a very threatening environment. Anything that has to do with appraisal or evaluation is just really trying to point out their problems rather than helping them through them. And I don't think that evaluating teachers is like trying to tell them they're wrong or they don't know how to teach or that's not the way to do it. If you haven't role model it, at least in the school, did you model it? Did you show us, you know, a teacher training model that can improve our practices? And we haven't tried at least to learn from it. So it's I'm just, you know, I went off topic maybe. I'm just analyzing what you said and how did it relate to my context in some ways. So it is a very, even now, you turn on, I listen to the news almost every day in Lebanon. It is a culture of blame. You see this politician blaming this politician blaming the government blaming the religions and sects, and everyone is blaming each other. Is that I couldn't work because this one did not allow me. I couldn't do these things for the people because this guy did not allow me. You hear it. You just open the news now, and you will find it. Just now, as we're speaking, you will find a talk show where it's a blame culture. It's very, very predominant, if I may say.
Thank you, Mayssa. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. And I have another question about Alison, in your experience at school. To what extent are teachers and parents able to talk about the growth of children from a human point of view? Thank you.
Sorry, when you said about, is it in teaching science? Can you just ask the question again, please?
Yes. At school, to what extent are teachers and parents able to talk together about the growth of the children from the human point of view? If there is a moment, I don't know, in England.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think what I'm interested in doing is asking people to define their terms. Whenever I'm working with a research problem, I've been privileged to teach hundreds and hundreds of master's colleagues who are educational leaders, head teachers in schools. So they are my colleagues and I admire and respect them. But what I can offer is research skills to help them use research to improve their processes and practices. So I guess I'm asking them, you know, can you define what it is to be human? And how do you map that back to the standards? And how do you map that back to the intended learning outcomes of the curriculum? And for me, some of the most exciting learning is perhaps in research in terms of religious education of all faiths and none. It's a place where we can learn about different stories of good acts and maybe those that are less favorable, and where we can really learn about each other's cultures, about each other's beliefs, about each other's values, and celebrate and honor each other's culture and all faiths and none. And I'm not so sure that that happens in other curriculum subjects, maybe to some extent in citizenship, but I'm just wondering that in maths, for example, if we are reducing things to the human, or whether we're opening up to the human, how are we defining maths in terms of, do we understand it's a system to help us understand the world that's human made? And because it's human made, it's got imperfections. So we have things like pi, we have irrational numbers, because it's got bits missing that we don't know yet, we don't understand. We don't have a perfect number system because humans aren't perfect, but it's helping us understand the world. We don't understand why bees can fly, we can't make synthetic honey, and we can't make a seed. So how we define things in this world, we're fooling ourselves because we can't define many things in this world, but the things we can define are what is necessary for us to live without violence, what is necessary for us to live in peace and prosperity for all, for social and economic well-being for all, what kind of learning, intended learning outcomes, and what kind of transferable skills, critical, autonomous creativity, thinking skills, collaboration, solidarity, competition, what kind of competences do we need to help young people really develop their humanity? So I think unless we define humanity as a school, as part of our strategic plan, and map that humanity definition to a critical understanding of it. So if we have children from different faiths, all faiths and none, how are they defining humanity? Is it possible to compare and contrast and come with a synthesized definition of humanity that all the children at that school can provisionally agree with, that informs the school rules, so that everybody feels honoured? We move from dishonour in institutionalised racism, which is a very real phenomena, to honouring and respecting and eradicating institutionalised racism, which once we define these things, we can find a roadmap to eradicate black-white achievement gaps, BAME white achievement gaps. We can eradicate poverty in terms of class system. We can eradicate differences in terms of gender and special educational needs and disability. In fact, all of the protected characteristics of the Equality Act. But until we define humanity and who is humane and who isn't, I don't think we're going to be able to understand what humanity is. And I don't think we're going to be able to develop logical, ethical and empirical knowledge to action strategies for becoming more humane, whatever that is and however we define it. I think in my talk, I mentioned the Declaration of Human Rights, but you know, maybe our colleagues can help us develop something better. I don't know, has that begun to answer the question?
Yes, yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
So I'm just thinking, does anybody have any more questions they might like to ask about this role of blame in society and how we are perhaps sometimes in education in a behaviorist approach, developing some people to find the back door even if there isn't one, and some people to go straight to the front door? Are there ways in which we can help to define what that is and find pathways to more inclusion and equity, equitable approaches to learning, do you think? Or is that for our next topic?
Yeah, I think we might discuss it in our next topic. You're on mute, Alison.
In the next meeting on the 11th of May, we're talking about how we connect with others, how we take reasonable risks, and how we can become creative. So I hope that would be useful, and how it helps us start to take risks, to move from blame to praise and support each other in solidarity to become, perhaps achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and move more to sustainable prosperity and peace for all as a goal. So I'd like to thank everybody here for attending, and I'd particularly like to thank Kathleen for your amazing contribution and for helping us have some insights into relationships with your own grandchild that's helped us understand and gain a better understanding. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you all. I mean, it's I always, well, when I as I explained to Alison before, when I came in here, I was probably approaching this from a slightly different perspective, but I'm finding this conversation really interesting, and I hope to be part of this conversation moving forward, and I'll try not to contribute too much.
I hope you do, Kathleen. You make wonderful contributions. Really appreciate you, and thank you so much, Mayssa, and thank you so much, Daniela. And I look forward to working with everybody again on the 11th of May. And do communicate on the Facebook if you have any questions. Please send them to us. You have all our contact details. And thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye all. Thank you.